Has Upstream helped make your worldview bigger and older? Maybe something you've heard on the show has shaped the way you view your calling, habits, vocation, or recreation. We want to hear from you. Visit colsoncenter.org/up-listeners to leave us a short audio message. We look forward to hearing from you. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. These days, we all consume media on an almost daily basis, often with the sense that our brains can be turned off, that it's just entertainment or a way to unwind at the end of the day. And some movies and TV shows really are aimed at our lowest IQ moments. But since the medium was invented, directors, actors, writers, and reviewers have often taken it seriously as an art form. They've poured their hearts and souls into it, trying to give audiences something that enriches their lives, provokes thought or deep emotion, or even just prompts self-reflection. Of course, few of those behind our entertainment are what we'd call Christians or have a Christian worldview. And this raises a serious challenge for Christian viewers. How do we consume, or better yet, engage with this art form critically and fruitfully? Can we meet it on its own terms? Or does that expose us to the danger of false ideas? How do we avoid turning every piece of entertainment into a sermon illustration? And if there are true ideas in the media we consume, how do we relate them to Christian truths? In short, how do we watch movies well? Well, my guest today has thought a lot about that question. John Ehrett is an attorney and writer who frequently reviews movies for The Spectator and other publications. He holds an MAR from the Institute of Lutheran Theology and a JD from Yale Law School. I'll add that I've followed his work online for years now, particularly his film reviews, and found them just tremendously helpful and thought-provoking. John Ehrett, welcome to Upstream. It's great to have you.
Well, Shane, thanks so much for having me. I've listened to this podcast before, and you've had some great guests on here, and it's a tough act to follow. But yeah, happy to be here.
Oh, thanks. Well, C.S. Lewis wrote in the Screwtape Letters something that I think is helpful to kick off the conversation, as is often the case with Lewis. He said that there are two equal and opposite errors people fall into with regard to the devils. And I think the same thing can kind of be said, not to meme Lewis too hard, but the same thing can kind of be said with entertainment. The first mistake is to count curse words and cigarettes and premarital kisses and kind of go, well, here's our verdict on the movie based on these sorts of things. Just ignore the deeper message. The other error is to try to Christianize everything to the point that we miss more subtle and often human messages or potentially shallow and bad messages. What's been your experience with Christians and movies? What are the high points and the low points?
Oh boy, it's funny that you mentioned the counting curse words, because when I was growing up, I would read the plugged-in online movie reviews. I would read them against their intended purpose. I would read them and be like, "Wow, that movie sounds super cool. It's got all this amazing action, and looks like it's got some interesting messages." And I was not reading that through the lens I think it was originally intended. And so, yeah, I think that for a long time, that was kind of the dominant interpretation for how Christians engage culture and engage movies. And it doesn't seem like that's so much the case anymore, which I think has been really salutary. But, at the time when I was reading those reviews, I was a young teenager, and I was excited to engage culture and very sanguine about, I think, what that could mean. And now I'm a dad, many years later. And so I read these things through a different lens. And I think about the world that my kids are going to live in and the media that they're going to be exposed to. But I think it also has to be considered that the Bible tells us that when I was a child, I thought as a child and I spoke as a child. And there's a difference between entertainment that's appropriate for children, and there's a difference between entertainment that's appropriate for adults. And I think that's a distinction that's worth drawing, especially when we consider issues and ideas that are simply too complicated for kids, or that expose facets of life They really are parts of the human experience. And the Bible's very, very blunt about aspects of that human experience as well. Just read the book of Judges. And I think cinema in a lot of ways can speak intelligently to that, and even Christianly to that, without just being something that's kind of the lowest common denominator of what you might want to everybody in the family to watch together at the age of 4 for your kids.
Right. Yeah, that's an experience that I had as well. And I think there's a common confusion, at least as you go back toward the late 90s, early 2000s in Christian culture. And I don't want to be one of those guys who looks back on everything I grew up with and just bashes it, carte blanche. That's not a kind way to look back on people who tried very hard to do the right thing. And it's not a good way to honor your father and mother, right? But I think there was a conflation that happened oftentimes between stuff that's quote unquote family friendly and stuff that's actually edifying and good and noble and true and worth watching, right? So the fact is that things like, and to take a really obvious example, many Christians ended up watching The Passion of the Christ back in 2004, I think it was. This is R-rated. It may be the first R-rated movie that many people saw. I think it might have been, well, actually, The Predator was the first R-rated movie I saw. But after that, it was it was Passion of the Christ. I think that was a useful moment to illustrate whatever you think about that movie and Mel Gibson's vision and how just incredibly overt he was with the violence. That movie is a good illustration of the fact that you can portray noble content and truthful content without it necessarily being family friendly. And that's an important distinction to make that was often missed in the sort of old style plugged in reviews. I think they've changed their style a lot in more recent years, but it was an implicit assumption that whatever's family friendly, whatever's on the VeggieTales level is that's what's good and edifying and worth watching. And that's not true. And you find examples of that throughout modern cinema, things that are really worth watching that I would never let my kids watch. When do you think you first realized that? And when did you first get to a point where you thought, you know what, I really love movies and I want reviewing and watching and thinking about movies to be a significant part of my intellectual development and my career as an adult?
Yeah, to your point, the first couple R-rated movies I ever saw were Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan. And both of those are films that they simply aim to depict reality as it was. They're not trying to embellish anything. They're not trying to titillate in any way. It's simply saying, this is what the Holocaust was like, or this was what the landing at Omaha Beach was like. And if you take away from that, if you try to sanitize that, like some of the old John Wayne movies of the 50s, then you're really neglecting, I think, what the point of those films is, which is to communicate that this happened. We memorialize this, we remember so that these things either don't happen again or that we can draw on the example of people's valor in that way. And so, yeah, that's something that I came to realize as I got a little bit older. But before that, the thing that originally catalyzed my interest in movies, this is very homeschooled, but there was a curriculum that was circulating for a while called Movies as Literature. That curriculum goes through a number of movies from very different stages of American cinema. So it starts out with Shane, the Western, and it ends with Chariots of Fire. And you have Raiders of the Lost Ark, Arsenic and Old Lace, The Maltese Falcon, Rear Window, and a lot of other real classics mixed in there as well. And what that course really asked students to do would be analyze movies from an aesthetic perspective as much as a content perspective and ask, why were these directorial choices made? How is this performance of this actor communicating a particular message? What are the themes in light of history that are being communicated here? There was a film about Quaker resistance to military service. Funny enough, my wife actually ended up doing the same course, Path Independently, so it's a thing we bonded over when we first got together. But that was one of the things that really inspired my interest in reading and writing about movies. And I've always loved the movie theater experience just as a kind of ritual. And I think that's something that is undervalued in this day and age where, we spend a lot of time being constantly distracted by other things. Especially if you have kids, your kids are always running around and playing and you can't really sit down and just focus on something for, 2.5 hours at a stretch. But the act of going to a movie theater it's a discipline in its own way. It's saying, I'm going to submit myself to this director's and these actors' vision for a length of time. I'm going to give my attention and my focus to this story and appreciate it for what it is. I'm being invited into that world. And that's something that I've always been thrilled by. And I'm so excited movie theaters didn't die during the pandemic because I was definitely worried about that for a while.
I love that answer, John, because I've always had the same sense walking into a movie theater. There's something of, a cinema. There's something of a hush that falls over your imagination. There's a stripping away of distractions, especially in the era of smartphones, right? There's an attention-grabbing aspect where the lights go down and the previews are done, and it's time. It's time to watch a movie. And we're really going to watch a movie for real this time, not like we do at home on our couch. Where I saw this comedy sketch where the TV is trying to tell a story to someone. It's like, okay, all right. So there's this main character, and then there's this other character, and they get into trouble, and the person on the couch goes, okay, yeah, I'm listening, and then he pulls up his phone, and the phone starts telling a different story to him. Like he's got his friend is the phone is his friend, and the TV is like, are you even listening? Do I even matter to you? Why am I here? I'm wasting my time. And the guy's like, no, I'm listening. No, And that's how it is. When you walk into a cinema, you can't do that sort of thing, at least not as easily. You actually have to pay attention, and you're motivated to pay attention. And that's always been the case. Now, obviously, COVID was a strain on them and so forth, but there's a magic there. There really is a movie magic. And I like that. The movies themselves bring a magic as well as an art form. I find that the engagement that you do there is much different from the engagement you do on these little videos you flick through on, TikTok or Reels or Instagram or something. Something is being asked of you, and it's not just a passive thing. It's a two-way street in a way when you sit down and watch a movie. It's an experience that requires your whole self. Talk about film as an art form, if you would. What is unique in your mind? What's its power? What does it have that nothing else does? Give us a reason why we should care and pay attention to it.
So I think one of the most interesting things about film, this is something that it's not necessarily the first thing you notice when you're growing up, but you start to realize that the camera is itself a character. And what that means is that you're not seeing just a slice of life as it is in and of itself slide past your daily experience that where things just happen and they don't seem to be connected into a particular story or anything. You're seeing a narrative that's been shaped for you by particular hands, and you're seeing through the eyes of the director in some ways, depending on, or particular characters, depending on how the story unfolds. You're being invited to interpret life, which can otherwise be very ambiguous and very complicated, through a narrative framework. You're being invited to see purpose and meaningfulness in decisions, whereas in ordinary experience, that can oftentimes drop out of the picture. So it's a different way of seeing in kind of a narratable frame that is really distinctive to the cinematic art form, and it's very enveloping in a way. You're invited to be part of that. You're invited in a lot of movies to place yourself into that story and to allow the director and the cast members to kind of guide you to the destination and to see in the way that they want you to see.
When you enter a movie theater or a cinema and you're preparing yourself for this experience, what questions are you asking? Are you completely open-minded? Are you critical? Are you allowing stuff that you've seen beforehand, like trailers and reviews and stuff, to influence you? What's your mindset like?
So I used to, when I was in college or whatever, I was addicted to watching movie trailers. I thought that was so exciting and so great. Now it seems like they basically just spoil the entire movie in the trailer half the time. You really see this with a lot of the superhero movies, where if you know some character is going to show up, you know that character is going to appear in the movie, no matter if they die partway through. And a lot of times the whole thing is spoiled for you before you go in. So I try not to watch movie trailers now. As life gets busier, it's nice just not have to keep up on these things. You live life and you're just like, oh, that movie that sounded interesting is out. I didn't see any previews for that. And so get to experience it afresh. But in terms of the questions that I ask myself when I go into a movie theater, I think there are a couple questions that come to mind. And the first one being, if somebody asked me to make this movie, what would I do differently? And that implicates the question of understanding what the movie is trying to accomplish in some ways. So what a movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark is trying to do is something very different than what a movie like Tar is trying to do. Raiders of the Lost Ark wants to tell a story about adventure. They want to recapture the energy and intensity of the old adventure serials. They want to have a patriotic story of defeating the Nazis, a kind of a adversion to transcendent realities that might be present in the world, even in kind of a cynical and secular age. And those are all things that movie's trying to accomplish, but it doesn't really want to be a lot more than that. A movie like Tar, on the other hand, you have a very serious cultural commentary about the relationship between artistic genius and exploitation of power. You have a very much slower and more sedate pace and much more deliberate filmmaking in some ways. In analyzing those movies, I think it's really important to ask what those movies are trying to accomplish, because it's not the same thing. You can talk about cinematic mastery, you can talk about quality of scoring or art design and things like that. But again, that's all in service of the purpose of what this thing is trying to accomplish. So you can ask this question of even superhero movies. You can ask, why was this decision made? And should this movie have been made differently to be more effective according to the standards of the genre or what it's trying to do? Everything doesn't have to be a piece of high art, as I think you mentioned earlier, but it does have to meet the norms of the genre in some ways, or if it departs from those, it has to give a good reason for why it's trying to shake up the formula. Sometimes you get something really genius. Christopher Nolan's take on Batman, I think, really does change what the superhero genre was trying to do for a long time. Hasn't really been effectively replicated since then, a lot of bad imitators, but it really was groundbreaking at the time. It had a very different feel, much more like a Michael Mann or Martin Scorsese movie than anything that had come before that. And then kind of a subordinate question to this that I do ask myself is this movie trying to say something, or is this movie just trying to make money? And I had the opportunity at one point to see some of the screener notes that circulate after test screenings of movies are done. And those were the screener notes for The Meg, which was the movie about the giant shark with Jason Statham that came out a few years ago.
Hey, you're speaking my language now.
I mean, you're the Megalodon King. So yeah. Right. I enjoyed that movie in the theater, and I'm sure I will see the sequel. But let me tell you, like the screener notes are very, very banal, and they're very focused on, how much money is this movie going to make in China? That's why we're going to set this in China. Does Jason Statham play well abroad? Do we need more international actors? And a movie like that's clearly been made by a committee as opposed to a particular person. I think the way in which you approach a movie like that, you need to know going in that you're not going to get anything particularly meritorious. And I think I was at, this might have been Worldview Academy, and somebody described movies like that as basically just a slightly elevated form of sleep. And I think that's pretty much the case.
It's like when you go to sleep and you have a dream, and it's very nonsensical. There's all kinds of random disconnected things. The plot doesn't make any sense. And you can switch from scene to scene to scene. And that's kind of what these movies are. Well, tell me then, do you think that, and this is one of the questions that I wanted to ask, do you think that there is a place for what we call popcorn cinema, the kind of mindless stuff? I mean, you're a student of the high art sort of film in many ways, the films that confuse a lot of people. I mean, you probably found a great deal of meaning in Isle of Dogs or Island of Dogs or whatever that is, right? Or Grand Budapest Hotel or something.
So I hate Wes Anderson movies. That's so funny. Like I can't stand his art style. But I don't think I've ever made it through a single Wes Anderson movie from start to finish. So that's definitely a gap in my canon. Yeah, I do think there's a place for the entertainment and just the sheer joy of it. And because I think about the stories that I grew up on, but before I cared about, what this movie is trying to say about culture or geopolitics or man's place in the world, I just liked adventure stories. And I grew up reading G.A. Henty books and Robert Louis Stevenson and stories like this that were they were portrayals of what in a lot of ways it means to be an adult fighting evil and doing the right thing. And as a child, I loved stories like that. And I think there's a place for all of us to be kind of shocked out of the day-to-day ennui by the reminder that, we are in, from a Christian perspective, we are in a spiritual battle against powers and principalities, that we are part of a bigger story that transcends us. And even silly reminders of that, I think, do have a place. And so I can't wait to introduce my kids to a lot of the movies I grew up on. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is higher. I guess Star Wars are both higher brow than that. But even some of the dumber stuff like Spider-Man movies and things like that, I can't wait to show off that. And I think there's definitely a place for that alongside some of the more sophisticated takes on culture and society and the cosmos.
Yeah, and there's moments in even some of those popcorn flick type things. So I'm thinking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? I think a lot of that stuff is probably produced in order to provide fan service and make money. I don't want to be too cynical about it. I know a lot of people have a good vision for it. And I found movies like, I thought Black Panther was quite thought-provoking in many ways. It was a classic adventure story, and I think it told a really good, it told a good story and conveyed a good lesson. But there are even moments in stuff like, think back to Age of Ultron, which was one of the Avengers movies, I guess. And there's this moment toward the end of it where a ruined Ultron climbs out of this canyon and meets Vision, who is like him as he was supposed to be. He's like the angelic picture of the fallen Ultron. And at that moment, when I watched that, I was like, okay, this is the most significant moment in this whole movie, because Ultron is doing the Milton's Satan thing here. He's like, I would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. And he just has this kind of bitter, sarcastic conversation with Vision, who is pure goodness in this scene. It's like this broken creature that can barely stand to be in the presence of this marvelous creature. And he just chooses at the end. He's like, well, I'm evil and that's it. So let's do this. And Vision destroys him. And that was you even see this kind of stuff, and this is going to sound cheesy, but you even see this kind of stuff going back to the Transformers movies, right? Where there's this angel and demon imagery. And obviously, you're speaking to a Western audience when you make this kind of movie. You're telling a Western kind of story. Inevitably, you're going to tap into some of this stuff. I don't know how much of it is intentional, how much of it is subconscious, but I find that's the most meaningful part of otherwise popcorny stuff. I think having the eyes to notice that is important, even if you don't look at that and go, that's the most important thing. So I rewatched the Harry Potter series with my wife the last couple of months, right? And I was a big fan of the books. She hasn't read the book, so I was filling in all the gaps, explaining everything to her, being like, okay, this is why this happens. This is why this happens. And I think you did something similar recently because you were posting your little Harry Potter commentary. But boy, the way that good and evil play out toward the end of that story, even, and I think Harry Potter is a few eyebrow levels above Age of Ultron, right? But as a movie, you see a lot of those good and evil themes play out again in ways that tell you deeper truths that maybe are implicit in the imagination of those who wrote and acted and produced the movies, but are worth noticing. And you don't notice it if you just go into it being like, I'm going to get entertained here. I'm going to get excited by imagery.
Boy, that's the truth. And yeah, totally agree that you start to see this kind of, it's almost like a deep archetypal grammar that plays out in movies that are made even in a post-Christian society. You can't lose a lot of that imagery and a lot of those themes and motifs because and I think Tom Holland really brings this out in his book Dominion, that we can't lose that kind of imagination that we've been bequeathed from the Christian tradition. A great example of this, and this is very funny, is David Harbour's new movie Violent Night, which is all about Santa Claus doing a Die Hard type movie. I was aghast when I watched it because it ends with some of the most explicitly Christian imagery I've ever seen in an action movie like this. Santa Claus, after fighting the bad guys, ends up crucified, stabbed in the side, and resurrected and ascends into heaven. And shockingly, none of the other critics who wrote about this movie caught this. And so even though this movie is a very silly movie, I didn't expect any of this. This imagery is there, and these stories are there, and they're trying to communicate using a symbolic language that is very resonant to people who are even a post-Christian civilization. And the flip side of this, which is really interesting, is if you watch movies that play with even biblical ideas and concepts outside kind of that Western cultural milieu, and I have in mind here Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is a very well-regarded anime, and I'm not a big anime person, but I did watch this because it was well acclaimed. That movie and that series uses a lot of biblical ideas in it, but it doesn't understand them, and it doesn't cohere them into anything vaguely resembling the Christian tradition. It just uses the imagery to tell a story about giant monsters fighting other giant monsters. There's no sense of transcendence whatsoever. And so it's not the concepts themselves so much as the deep Christian imagination, I think, that within which those symbols make sense. And Hollywood hasn't lost that in a lot of ways, even though it might do its best to repudiate it in some ways.
Okay, so we understand the grammar of what they're doing because we're participants in the original grammar, right? We're Christians. We know where this comes from. We've got Tom Holland's secret working in the back of our minds. It's like, and that's, of course, you're speaking my language again. You've talked about megalodons. You've talked about Tom Holland. Everyone who listens to this podcast will know John has his finger on the beat of Upstream here. But with Holland, one of the things he points out is that, we don't realize this anymore. We don't remember where it comes from. And a great deal of this stuff is subconscious for both the viewers who are resonating with it and the directors and producers and writers and actors who are living into it. And this is one of the things that amazes me about modern Hollywood. And I speak of that, as that kind of idiom for the film industry in general, that they can be so opposed to Christianity on paper in a sort of explicit way. We don't support Christian values. We're against fundamentalists. We're against bigots. We're totally on board the modern secular project and the sexual revolution. But on the other side, they produce things that have so many Christian resonances and remind those who know what they're looking at of Christian theology. It's just a weird disconnect and a weird moment we're in. And I think this probably gets to one of the bigger questions I think we have to tackle in this discussion. And it is, where do we as Christians get off of this train? Or can we stay on it? I mean, how fully and seriously can we engage with entertainment that is on paper leading us in a bad direction? That the stated intentions of many of these Hollywood directors, producers, writers is to repudiate the Christian past. And yet in so many ways, they're playing in the Christian sandbox still. How do you approach a movie like that? Because there's this thing C.S. Lewis said that it always sticks in my mind, and it kind of guilt trips me when I'm judging a work of art unnecessarily or prematurely, I should say. And that is that when you look at a work of art, or you experience it or read it or listen to it, you have to submit yourself to the artist in some ways. You can't go in as purely a judge. You actually have to have an open mind and heart. What's your posture, and how do you kind of balance those two realities?
So I do think it's a little bit different when you're working in a critical capacity where, it is kind of your job to recognize what some of these movies might be and explain why those things would be kind of outside the parameters. And one good example of this that I would say is the most dangerous kind of movie to my mind is one that succeeds as a work of art to the extent that it does say something true, but that truth is only a piece of a fuller truth. And that truth comes at the expense of expressing a full contextual understanding of that truth. So here's the example that really comes to mind. This is a very popular film. Everything Everywhere All at Once was a movie that came out last year, and it's very much focused on the idea of the multiverse and what it means to live well in a world where there are multiple infinite timelines of overlapping different dimensions where basically anything that could happen might have happened. That film, in a lot of ways, a lot of people said that it really spoke to them, that they were left crying, that it was a profoundly moving experience. Where that movie ultimately ends is in the almost explicit affirmation that nothing really matters. It's a pure nihilism at the end of it, but you can try to be nice anyway. You can try to be nice and do your best in the face of the fact that nothing ultimately matters. And Rod Dreher's got a great piece about how a huge sector of people in Generation Z, even people who are self-professed Christians, deeply resonate with this message, that they feel powerless over their own lives. They feel like nothing that they do matters. They feel like God doesn't really care about them in a deep way, and they feel like they're doomed to live in a world that doesn't have a place for them. And so basically all they can do is try to be nice in the face of crushing existential despair. And so a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think it captures the truth that if there were multiple infinite timelines where anything that could happen would happen, then yes, things would be meaningless. If there was no eschatological end in light of which everything does make sense. History is not going anywhere because every possible history has already happened. That is a correct observation. And it's correct to say that a lot of people feel like the world is meaningless and purposeless. But a movie that affirms that explicitly and says, yes, this is how the world is, and this is how you should comport yourself in the face of this. You should just lean into that nihilism. That, to my mind, is dangerous in a way that a lot of movies aren't, because it does speak to the human yearnings in a way. And just it expresses part of the truth rather than a fuller truth. And it's problematic for that reason. I hate to use the word problematic in that context, but it is.
That's one of the words I hate. I also hate content when referring to writing or any other creative enterprises. Okay, so that's an example, a great example of a movie that has a genuinely subversive message that you would object to on a philosophical and moral level. What are some of your favorite movies and why? And I say this expecting and hoping for some surprises, things that my listeners would go, oh, I never really thought about that. I know that one of them is Pan's Labyrinth. Give us, you can give us that one and then others and explain what it is that you love so much about them.
Sure, yeah. Pan's Labyrinth, it's a Spanish language movie that was directed by Guillermo del Toro, who's a fascinating filmmaker who was raised Catholic, and his movies, they very much blend together Catholic and even pre-Christian imagery, and what is effectively a critique of a scientific materialist view of reality. And Pan's Labyrinth is it's a dark fairy tale that's set during the Spanish Civil War between the fascists and the communists. And it's about a young girl who, as her world is collapsing around her in reality, as her abusive stepfather persecutes her and her family, she's increasingly drawn into a frightening world of tests where he's invited a chance to prove that she is in fact the missing daughter of the king of the underworld. And that's a very Celtic mythological element that comes to the fore here. But the movie ultimately, without too many spoilers, the story beats that ultimately do drive that story are fundamentally more Christian than pagan in many ways. And it resolves in a way that very much reflects the influence and kind of the transforming influence of a Christian tradition or worldview over and above kind of those pre-Christian or pagan concepts. Fascinating study of what I would say is a sacramental view of reality, where material things that we experience in our everyday lives do in fact have deeper meaning that might not be visible to us if we don't have the eyes to see it, if we don't perceive those realities around us as being part of a cosmic purposive order that transcends us. And so the movie invites us to see reality in that way and to be drawn into that story. And It's just a beautiful film that's beautifully shot, well acted, amazing soundtrack. I go back to it probably every year or so. Other movies that I really enjoyed, some of these are more recent films. James Gray has an excellent film called Ad Astra, which is a study. Brad Pitt plays an astronaut who's in search of his missing father, who went dark off of the edge of Neptune while searching the universe for extraterrestrial life. And it's very much shot like Apocalypse Now or Heart of Darkness, where he progresses from stage to stage through the moon, through Mars, through deep space, all the way for reunion with the father and an answer to questions about human beings' place in the universe and what truly matters. And so it's very much an existential journey. It's very slow.
Well, except for that part with the crazy baboons in the space station, or the abandoned ship, that really got me.
That is very true. Yeah, it's very much, I think, a study of human beings' place in the cosmos and what it means to live in a way that's consistent with human dignity and human uniqueness in a world that's can seem very alien and indifferent. And so that's a message that I think it's rare in science fiction recently, which is oftentimes tends to be either pretty jokey or basically just fantasy stories in space.
What are your thoughts on the Christopher Nolan canon? Because I know you've written about M. Night Shyamalan's stuff. In many ways, he was seen, I guess, in the early 2000s as this great genius who everything he put out was just, unflappably good. It was just mind-blowingly exciting to see what the reveal was going to be. What's the twist? And then he sort of fell off the wagon for a while. And I don't know anyone who likes a bunch of these movies that have happened lately. And then he did another one more recently that you reviewed well. You thought it was probably a return to some of the old qualities that we loved about Shyamalan. But what about Nolan? Because I as you're talking about Ad Astra, I can't help thinking of Interstellar. And then in many ways, the best of his work is embodied in, like you said, the Dark Knight trilogy. And then Inception has got to be one of my favorites. And I know that's a kind of polarizing one as well. And then even going back to things like The Prestige, there's a cool project going on here. What are your thoughts on his stuff?
Yeah, so Nolan's very interesting to me because at least as I read him or watch his movies, there's very much some common themes that almost always show up in his films, which are otherwise very different subject matter and different genres. One of the biggest ones is an obsession with time and the idea there's almost kind of a hard deterministic logic that moves through his films where everything that happens has to happen. And we are, as the viewers, inserted into a story that is going to always play out a particular way because that's how human beings are. That's how the narrative logic ultimately leads. Everything ends up feeling seamless and self-contained in some ways. So everything does wrap up ultimately in a way that can be explained. There's always an explanation for the things that we see on screen, even the things that seem mysterious. And there's nothing really that's left open-ended in Christopher Nolan movies, which I think is both a virtue and a vice in some ways. And the vice being that it doesn't really point outside itself to anything. Everything ultimately does resolve within the confines of the story. The kind of the mysterious questions that people linger over in audiences for years to come, Nolan will give you answers to those in ways that Stanley Kubrick or somebody like that simply won't. But the virtue of it is an incredible technical mastery of just how to assemble a story that's compelling and engaging and really does reward repeat viewings.
Yeah, I agree. There is that element of mechanism and materialism and self-contained feel about it. I've got that sense as well. This is why something like Interstellar does leave you with a sense of wanting more. There is an emptiness at the end of that, almost like, okay, well, this is we've gone the full loop and we've seen how everything plays out. What is there left at the end? And it's just like, well, you cry with your kid who is now vastly older than you because of the weird time warp that happened in that movie. And it's moving, it's beautiful, but yeah, there is something there that's kind of missing.
I would have liked Interstellar so much more if once he goes into the Tesseract, we have no dialogue, just silence. We're impressionistically shown things that are happening, and we're left to interpret that for ourselves. Once you start getting into it's human beings from the future that are reaching back to guide us to our human perfection, that takes the oxygen out. And I felt the same way about Denis Villeneuve's Arrival, which has also a tendency to over-explain itself, but it's otherwise a very elegant movie. the ending is powerful enough as it is. Again, I think you could put the dialogue on mute and just not have it over explained to you. And so I like a little mystique in my movies, and I know there are a lot of audiences that don't. You get endless Screen Rant articles saying the ending of this movie explained. There seems to be a whole field of entertainment criticism that is trying to see every piece of art as like a J.J. Abrams movie, which ends in a mystery box and has really a set of secret things that can in principle be spoiled. And I think the best kind of movie is one for which spoilers don't matter. Like resolving the mystery doesn't mean the thing is not watchable or interesting, because the story stands for itself, and you're not just trying to have the trap sprung on you in some ways. You're being invited to appreciate something that's perennial.
I'm talking today with John Ehrett, lawyer by day, movie reviewer by night. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after this. Upstream listeners, I'm excited to announce that registration is now open for the Colson Center National Conference, happening May 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Indianapolis. This year's theme is Earth Crammed with Heaven, an invitation to encounter God in His mighty works. Join speakers like Justin Bailey, Ryan Bomberger, Dr. Kristen Collier, and many more as we explore glories often referenced but rarely explored, the truths and beauties that claim our wonder and demand our protection. God has filled His creation with His presence. He has blessed His world with His glory. The Colson Center National Conference is an invitation to see God as He has made Himself known and to encounter Him and His mighty works. Register now at colsonconference.org. We're back on Upstream talking about how to watch movies well with John Ehrett. You mentioned a phrase a second ago, John, the mystery box, and you've written about this as a motif that recurs throughout modern films. It's a sort of structure that we expect, especially in superhero movies, where we're finding out stuff along the way. And this is just recurring again and again and again. And you kind of critique the prevalence of that and suggest maybe we should wean ourselves off of the mystery box. Can you explain what the mystery box is, why you are criticizing it, and then what's the alternative we may need to kind of look back towards?
If you think back to the 7th Star Wars movies, this was The Force Awakens. That is the consummate mystery box movie. And J.J. Abrams, the director, is associated with this because he basically made all his movies like this ever since he started making cinema. So Lost, the TV show, has this. You have it in Super 8, you have it in his Star Trek movies, and you have it in his Star Wars movies. And what that basically means is we're going to throw the audience into the middle of things where they're going to meet characters and be confronted with circumstances that they will not have full disclosure of all the information available to them. And then we're going to slowly reveal bits and pieces of information to them to fill out their world and explain the internal logic of what's going on around them. And a more recent TV show that really does do this as well was Westworld, which was canceled by HBO after its 4th season. And the whole conceit of Westworld was that the show was basically unfollowable for the first 8 or 9 episodes because it was asynchronous timelines. So you were watching the story chopped and diced into bits and pieces that were then assembled out of order on the theory that people on Reddit or Twitter, whoever, would go and piece together the story, try to figure out the mystery altogether. So a mystery box story is one that it tries to kind of get the fans all involved in figuring out the mystery together, as opposed to just saying, here we are, here's Mordor over here, here's the Shire, we're going to try to take the ring and drop it in Mount Doom, which is very much how a lot of older movies would proceed. They're not trying to conceal information from you.
It's the 6-minute prologue with the Lord of the Rings, where it gets you up to speed on the last couple of thousand years of what's happened. And then here we go, we're in the Shire. All right, we're in the story. Totally different motif.
Exactly. And I think the mystery box was fun the first couple times around because it felt new and fresh, and it was fun to all engage these questions together and speculate about it with your friends, etc. But directors like Abrams and people who have been aping that style do it so much now that you lose any reason to rewatch stories once the information becomes clear. And kind of an early form of a movie that sort of works this way, and I don't want to say too much, is The Usual Suspects. And The Usual Suspects probably did this best, where by the end of the movie, the ending, without giving too much away, does reinterpret everything that came before in kind of the same way that Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense did. But the movies are still rewatchable on their own terms because they're well put together movies on that basis. And the reason the information is concealed makes sense within the terms of the story. But for something like Westworld, the reason that the story is confusing is completely artificial. The people who put the story together decided that we want to create a mystery by just presenting information out of order. There's no narrative logic that it needs to be that way. There's no story about people finding out the truth in this way. If you recut the story, it would be a linear story without any discovery element to it at all. And so I think that the mystery box, in a lot of ways, is a crutch that avoids trying to tell a story that people will relate to other than just the first wave of people that makes it to the opening weekend before everybody spoils it online.
I love this. It's very interesting because there are different ways of doing movies, and none of this is necessarily a reflection of this or that value structure. But, Christians believe in beauty. We believe that things should be beautiful. They should be excellent. And the fact is, when you overdo something, you overuse a story structure, or you become cynical about it, like we were saying Westworld is, where there's no purpose for this. There's no telos of this. It just is a mystery box because we want people to unlock the mystery. We don't know where we're going. And this was kind of the infamous problem with Lost, is it starts very exciting. You want to know the mystery. And then in the end, it's like I don't know a single person who wasn't disappointed with the way that whole thing shook out. And that's going back, quite a few years. There needs to be a purpose to this stuff. And when I look back on twists or mystery boxes or stories that I really love, obviously The Sixth Sense is one of the greatest examples in film, but one of the great examples in science fiction writing is Ender's Game. And this is the one that, because I had studiously avoided, Ender's Game had been out for decades before I ever touched it, but because I had studiously avoided learning about it, when I get to the big point, and I will preserve that for my listeners who haven't read it, when I get to the big reveal and realize that the whole goal of what we've been working toward has actually just been accomplished, and you feel the devastating impact of that, that was very effective. So there's nothing wrong with this way of doing things. You can do it this way as a storyteller, but in order to be, I guess, excellent and to have artistic integrity, you need to know how to do something else. And then you need to have a purpose for doing it this way, other than just to, create a novelty, other than just to surprise people. I want to transition over into your work reviewing films. And I want to think in explicitly Christian terms here. So your allegiance is to the true story. You are a lover of God's story and history, of that grand myth that Lewis says all stories ultimately just kind of participate in, and we love them because they participate in some way in that grand myth. How do you as a Christian approach reviewing movies? How do you decide what's good, what's not? How do you parse out the spiritual messages that are happening there? And I'm asking a very open-ended question on purpose because I want to know the secret sauce. I want to know what makes your reviews work and what you think makes movies that you're talking about work.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I think a huge part of what it means to be a Christian is that you're seeing your life as part of a bigger story. And the loss of that story is, I think, one reason we have such a crisis of meaning among people today, is that if you see yourself as the protagonist completely, then that is also the responsibility to be your own author. And when you see yourself as the part of somebody else's story, subject to a different author, you interpret life differently, and you interpret other things in the world as reflective of or departures from that particular story. And so the movies that I love and the movies that I resonate with are movies that do reflect the fact that life has meaning and purpose, even if that's not necessarily explicitly Christian, but the movies acknowledge that there is an arc and an order to our lives that does transcend just drifting aimlessly through life at the behest of our pleasures. And so a couple of recent movies that really take the opposite pole that I saw were After Sun and The Worst Person in the World, which were both very, very bland movies that were just kind of studies in human misery under the conditions of modernity. And I was not a big fan of either of those movies because they depict protagonists who are just drifting, aimless. They don't have anything to say other than, wow, life is miserable. But I think a Christian reading of stories like this sees that what is missing in those stories is that the protagonists don't see themselves as part of a larger story themselves. They have nothing with which they can interpret the data of reality or their desires or their need to restrain their desires. And so I make no bones about the fact that I write from a Christian perspective, but I think that is a paradigm that is helpful in interpreting a wide variety of content and movies that approach the world from different narrative perspectives, and placing those narratives into conversation one with another is, I think, one of the most important responsibilities of someone who reviews movies Christianly.
Do you think that the director and all those involved in the work of the movie have to be aiming consciously in the kind of direction that you're talking about, and to give the kind of redemptive message? And if not, how do you recognize the good in there, the human good that's emerging despite themselves, without using your imagination too much, if that's the way I can put it? And you know what I'm talking about, the reading into things, stuff that the director himself or herself would not recognize.
I wouldn't even necessarily use the word redemptive, and I don't necessarily think everything has to have a happy ending. The Departed can be an excellent movie without it having to end in really resolution, as I think the Christian tradition would conceive of it. The question that I ask from a Christian perspective is there truth here and is there beauty here? And the classical tradition would roll those together metaphysically, reflecting those are two aspects of the one transcendental God. But I think we can logically distinguish between form and content. And a movie can be put together very effectively and really tell a story in a way that reflects, I think, the artistry of our creator to weave different strands of life together, even while depicting painful and difficult content. And so there's a balance there, but I think just the sheer mastery of being able to see people and one's characters for who they are, bring out different dimensions of who they are, and recognize that their stories do have meaning in a way. Those are Christian assumptions that are being woven together into a story that might or might not have explicitly Christian content or end in a Christian conclusion.
Where do you draw the line? Because I know many listeners will be hearing this conversation and thinking, well, John obviously watches a lot of stuff. He's a viewer of latitude. He goes out there and he watches films and TV shows that many of us wouldn't give the time of day. And then he engages with them on some kind of spiritual or philosophical level, tries to understand what it is that the people behind the movie are saying or trying to convey. But is there a personal limit for you? And then how would you see the limit for Christians in general? So I'm thinking of, things like graphic nudity, right? So I think there's probably a complex and nuanced conversation to be had there. But I think there's also probably a limit. There's a place where this is becoming something that falls outside of the realm of, film art. This is becoming pornographic. Where do you personally draw the lines and why?
My answer to that would be when the sexuality or nudity in a film becomes the reason for the thing's existence in the first place, as opposed to being in the service of something else. And I realize other people might draw that line in different places, but I think the sine qua non of what is pornographic is where it's about sex, and the point is sex. And something can be incidental to a story. You have sexuality in Schindler's List, but that's very incidental to the story, and it's driving the fact that there was exploitation of multiple fronts that occurred during the Holocaust, and that's an important part of that story. But I think, especially in a lot of what's called prestige TV now, we're really crossing that line into pretty much just sheer titillating exploitative content. And I think there's no good reason for people to be trying to redeem that.
Yeah, we call it sexposition.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's been the term used to describe where characters are just, they're going at it and they're talking and there's exposition happening, but really there's no reason why that couldn't have just happened in a normal exposition scene. That's just there in order to provide titillation and sensation and to create this sort of appeal to what did the director of Game of Thrones call it? The pervert side of the audience, and yeah, that's something that's genuinely going on. So I do appreciate the nuanced answer on that, though. That's a complicated question that is going to differ somewhat from person to person. I fall much more on the conservative side, where I want to kind of keep all of that out. But yeah, I recognize that there's definitely some nuance there. What do you do with the fact, and this is something that I mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth circling back to. What do you do with the fact that Hollywood on a conscious level, and in many or most instances, is trying to subvert the Christian worldview, is coming from an anti-God perspective? And I know this will be the question at the forefront of many of my listeners' minds, right? This is not an industry, whether we're talking about film or TV. This is not an industry where Christian assumptions about the world are exactly welcome. In many ways, to show your bona fides as a filmmaker, you kind of have to attack or subvert or question some aspect of the old Christian consensus. what do you do as a film reviewer and a film viewer when it comes to confronting that hostility? How do you subvert it? Do you ignore it? Do you buy into it in a provisional way? What are you doing exactly?
I will approach this from a slightly different direction. When I was in law school, one of the classes I took during my final semester was a reading group on progressive scholarship that the members of the faculty had put together, and they were debuting their own ideas. And I'm a fairly conservative person, and so this was obviously all the people who I will politically have a lot of issues with, but basically them debuting all their ideas for critique among other progressives. I kind of sat in the back of the room just to hear them out. And the most interesting thing about that experience was that I realized exactly how many concerns and anxieties and self-doubt lay beneath a lot of very strident negative statements about conservatives that were being made. And it was a very useful window into what people who were very different than me and had a very different approach to reality than me were really thinking, well, what they were concerned about. It helped me see them as human beings seeking some good or other in a disordered fashion, perhaps, but some good at some level. And I'm an Augustinian in this regard, and I think evil is an absence of the good, but people do engage in activities for the sake of some good or other. And if all good does come from God, then people might be pursuing that in different ways, in ways I would have a lot of issues with. But they are chasing, in a lot of ways, some sort of goal of feeling like they belong, feeling like they have unchosen acceptance. And I think that the Christian tradition offers better answers to that in a lot of ways, but understanding the logic that drives it in a way that's not explicitly antagonistic, I have found that to be a helpful way of getting inside the minds of people who are very different from me. And I would draw a line here between something that is some filmmakers' exploration of complex issues in a way that they intend to be viewed by other adults, and something like the Blue's Clues episode that has characters who've had top surgery being shown to children. And I think that the latter stuff is totally outside the pale because it's propaganda. Individuals reflecting among themselves on their struggles against despair and nihilism in a way that they want to show the world that other people are struggling with this. I have more compassion, I think, for that than I do something that's just trying to push an explicitly non-Christian agenda on people who can't sort that out and make those distinctions.
Right. I find one thing that strikes me is when the critique of the Christian past or the non-Christian agenda, or even just the residual bitterness toward Christianity, is done in a very clumsy and overt way. If it's not done well, because here's the thing, John, and this goes back to Tom Holland. This goes even to so I'm reading Christopher Watkin's Biblical Critical Theory right now, right?
Oh, me too. Excellent.
Okay, yeah, and I'm going to have him on in a week in Upstream.
Fantastic.
One of the things he's arguing for is that the more someone of a secular persuasion or a non-Christian religion earnestly pursues a critique of Christianity, the more they inevitably find themselves raising a Christian critique against Christianity, because the values and goods that they're pursuing inevitably are values and goods that God made, that he endorses. And what they're doing is they're pitting them against each other. This is the privation of good language that you're bringing in, the Augustinian sense that everything that exists is good in and of itself. The evil exists in evil doesn't exist. Evil consists in the privation of good, or in the wrong ordering of priorities and loves. And that's exactly what we see happen in all of these. It just seems again and again, when you drill down on any of those secular values or arguments against the old Christian consensus, which is what Watkins doing systematically in his book, you find that they're pursuing one or the other good that Christianity actually offers in harmony, paradoxical harmony, but harmony nonetheless. And that we can actually be the bigger, more mature person intellectually and approach those people and say, we get it. We get that you're after equality or justice. We get that you hate spiritual abuse. We get that demanding a blind leap of faith is a bad thing and there needs to be evidence. Or on the other side, there's some movies that confront the idea that evidence itself will do and that you have to take a blind leap of faith, right? Like obviously it's Mel Gibson, so it's cheating, but Signs is one of those examples where there is a blind leap of faith element that actually kind of resolves the plot. But you're right. There's an element of recognizing the true good. I guess for me, the challenge, and the ongoing open question is, am I big enough to fight this battle? When I enter a movie as a Christian, do I actually have the ability to out-narrate this narrative? Or is it going to get a hold of me in some way? Because I'm conscious of the fact that despite my Christian faith, I can be subverted. I can be at least drawn off the path for a little while into a detour in the, giant despair's field on my way to the celestial city, right? I'm not invincible to this sort of thing. And art's powerful. Art's compelling. It has the ability to sort of draw your heart in a direction that, might not be good for you to go. I remember, and this is an example, this is a kind of a silly example, but a couple years ago, I read the whole Wheel of Time series. And I hate the TV show. I would never recommend it. Don't ever watch that, folks. But, the Wheel of Time series, Robert Jordan really takes you for a ride. And at one point, late in the series, before the sort of setup for the climax of the story, which is finished by another author, Brandon Sanderson, he gets you to this point of very deep despair where you're just like, it's all a joke. It's all hopeless. All the characters really are just against the good guy, and there's nothing he can do. It's everything he does that's good just gets subverted. And you get in that mindset where you're like, you're right. It's all just hopeless. And then he turns it around in this beautiful way that you just, it's amazing. And that's what a good story does. But I'm conscious of that fact that I could get to a story that doesn't turn it around, that doesn't shepherd me in the right direction. So there's a balance there. Not really a question, but I think there's an ongoing tension there in my own consumption of media, if we can put it that way.
Oh, I completely agree. And, honestly, you asked about getting into movie reviewing in the first place. And that's one of the great blessings of writing about movies is you got to externalize this stuff. And so you can be a critic and you can engage this stuff and these cultural ideas, and then having to write about it and process it and work it out in light of the true story that I believe all other stories are just reflections of. Doing that kind of reflection, I've just found it to be a spiritually refreshing exercise in a lot of ways, because it does force everything to be contextualized in light of eternity in a way.
Well, there's a bunch more we could talk about. We're coming up to the end of our time here, John. I want to ask briefly about this thing we call Christian entertainment, right? And this is something that I mentioned to you before the show we wanted to touch on. And it's something that's kind of at the forefront of people's minds with things like Jesus Revolution and The Chosen. You've got these technically, much better made Christian articles of entertainment. And I'm full disclosure, I haven't seen Jesus Revolution. I'm a big fan of The Chosen. I like it. I think it's touching. It's not perfect, but it's a very moving sort of thing. And I interviewed Jonathan Rumi after the first season came out. So I've enjoyed it a lot. But it's obviously Christian, right? It's about Jesus. But there's Christian entertainment that is not explicitly about Jesus. And then there's entertainment that is about Christian themes that's not explicitly Christian. I think about a movie like A Hidden Life, which was just such an excellent film and has these resonant Christian themes, but nevertheless is not explicitly what we call Christian entertainment, right? You'd never put that in the same basket with a VeggieTales or a Bible Man or something like that to reach for children's entertainment unfairly. How do you draw those lines? What do you think Christian entertainment means? And is it good? Is it bad? Is it something that we can use sparingly? Should we just scrap it? What do you think?
So this is definitely not an opinion I would have had maybe 10 years ago or so, but I do now. I think Christian entertainment, explicitly Christian entertainment, does have a place. And I think that it's explicitly pedagogical. And I think that serves a valuable role, especially for people who are growing up. And the classical education tradition has a way of thinking about stages of knowledge that begin with grammar and then proceed into logic and rhetoric. And something like A Hidden Life is a study in rhetoric. That is a beautiful work that has been created and that expresses deep symbolic truths in a poetic fashion. And that's very different from the grammar, the nuts and bolts on which that's built, which can be simple presentations of Bible stories and Christian values and things that you get in VeggieTales and Adventures in Odyssey and things like that. And a movie like A Hidden Life is unintelligible if you don't have that kind of underlying grammar. And you can't begin with a movie like A Hidden Life and just immediately enter its world and understand the Christian depths that are going on there. And so I think a valuable distinction we can draw here is between allegory and symbolism. And this is actually a distinction I think Tolkien was well aware of. Once you know what the allegory is saying, what the underlying message of a story is, the meaning is completely contained in that thing. The allegory is an allegory that says a particular thing. A symbol points beyond itself in an open-ended way. And so I think once you get to the rhetoric stage, you're in the territory of symbols. And how do we express things that go beyond what we can necessarily put into words? But that doesn't mean that the allegorical or the grammatical or the simpler form, that doesn't have a place, and that it doesn't have a place in shaping imaginations in healthy ways from early on. And so I think that there will always and there should always be a distinction between Christian entertainment and secular entertainment on that front. And I hesitate to even use the term secular entertainment, but maybe less pedagogical entertainment. But yeah, I mean, do I still remember what Mr. Whitaker said about various issues? I absolutely do. And I'm in my 30s now, but I started listening to these when I was a child, and I'm glad that I have that in my head. And I would like my children to have that in their heads too. And I'd like them to become critical consumers of media that interpret the world from a Christian perspective in that way.
Yeah, same. And I was a huge Adventures in Odyssey kid. I listened to everything all the way up until, I guess, it was like the end of the Novacom saga, and then I sort of fell off because I was reaching a point of maturity where I just wasn't keeping up with it. But yeah, I want to go back through it with my kids for certain. They're on the Odyssey Adventure Club. They listen to the online stuff, but it's just not the same as the cassette tapes, where you could pop it in and you got a 24-minute episode. It's done. You can go to sleep. Yeah, it's very hard to replicate that. But one thing about Odyssey that's worth saying before we move on is that Odyssey was excellently done. It's very high quality audio dramatization. The team that they employed for that was always very talented, and it still is very talented. And so that's part of why it avoids some of the pitfalls that are stereotypical of older Christian entertainment. All right, here's my last question for you, John. If there's a string that you could tie around everyone's finger when they go into the cinema to see a movie, when they turn on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever to start a series, as Christians, what is the thing that they should be thinking or asking themselves when they begin to submit themselves in some way to this entertainment?
I think the question is, whose story is this telling and why? And is it telling a story that points outside itself, or is it telling a story of people being self-seeking and pursuing their own desires? That's really, I think, that something that, whether or not you're in the movie theater, that should be a question that we're asking. But it really comes to the fore when we're seeing somebody else's story and kind of being drawn into that world.
Yeah, I really like that. That's excellent. That mirrors a lot of what I try to do when I step into these things. Of course, I've got 4 kids, and so I don't have quite as much time as maybe you have to watch these things. But hey, maybe you'll get there. Maybe you'll find yourself watching a bunch of kids shows too, and you could review some of those.
Oh yeah, I'm sure everyone wants to read my Coco Melon reviews. And Paw Patrol. Hey, I mean, Paw Patrol, best valorization of blue collar work we've seen in a generation.
I know, I've heard that. I've heard people say Paw Patrol is based.
I mean, the puppies work hard, do the right thing. Yeah.
There you go. Well, John, this has been a fun conversation. Where can people go to find more of your work, read your reviews, keep up with you?
So I write for the Spectator World. That's where most of my movie reviews are. You can go on my website at literaryanalysis.net, which has a lot of back issues of movie reviews that I've written for Federalist, American Conservative, and a couple of other publications. And I'm on Twitter at John Ehrett.
Very good. My guest today has been John Ehrett, attorney and writer who frequently reviews movies and whose work has been just a touchstone for me over the last few years as I've watched movies and TV myself. John, thanks for joining me on Upstream. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app, and find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.